Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Auerbach, and I hope you and your loved ones are all doing okay in these difficult times. I'm really honored to be asked to speak with you today about mental health awareness. You may be wondering why this topic, as far as what it has to do with PJTC and why now. Well, first, May is Mental Health Month, so it's a good time to share information about mental illness, which affects 1 in every 5 US adults. And second, as you may have heard, there's a growing mental health crisis out there in response to the virus. A lot of people reporting distress, making calls to crisis lines and so on, though I won't be talking about COVID specifically today. That's certainly in the background there. And third, many faith leaders in recent years have been preaching more openly about subjects like mental illness, substance abuse, and suicide in an effort to try to get their congregations to come together to create a Sukkot Shalom, a shelter of peace and support for one another. We help to erase the stigma around mental illness by educating ourselves and by sharing our stories. So I'm going to be sharing some of my family's story with you here today, and also what I've learned as an advocate for mental health and suicide prevention awareness. If you'll bear with me one moment. Here we go. So what I'm really hoping you'll take away from today's presentation is that mental health awareness is everyone's business. It needs to be on all of our radar, whether we've been personally touched by mental illness in our lives or not. We all need to be better informed so we can deal with possible changes in our own mental state, so we can help with the mental health needs of others, and so we can build a caring community that supports the vulnerable, much as the book of Leviticus a couple of weeks ago instructed us to do. And as the Talmud tells us, quote, "Whosoever saves a life, it is as if they saved an entire world." This is my younger son, Noah, who we tragically lost to suicide when he was 21. He was a fun, adventurous guy with lots of interests and friends and abilities and talents until about age 19 when he lost a close friend to suicide. After that, he suffered from extreme depression, as well as what we later learned was PTSD and severe anxiety attacks. He was willing to try therapy for a while, but not to stick with medications. And by the time he came home from college on medical leave, he'd been off of any treatment for months and was in dramatic decline. Since he was over 18, by law, we as parents could not get him professional help or even speak with his past therapists. So we knew little of what was going on and even less of how to help him. Noah managed to run the Los Angeles Marathon as he had planned, and then 2 days later is when he took his life. He had ended his own unbearable pain and plunged all of us who loved him into a nightmare of trauma and grief. Before this tragedy, I never thought mental illness had anything to do with me or my family. We were just what they call the worried well. It took time to accept that my child was living with mental illness, along with his fear, shame, and ignorance about that illness, and to realize how much I did not know, such as how to manage major depression and live with someone who was severely depressed, and how untreated mental illness can harm the brain, as we saw with cognitive decline in Noah's interactions. Also, how to ask somebody if they are suicidal, but more specifically, to be ready to listen to what they have to say calmly. And I also didn't understand how losing somebody to suicide, as Noah had done at age 19, increases their own risk of suicide going forward. So in part, I share all this with you today in the hopes that you will be better prepared if, God forbid, a crisis comes into your life or your family's life. So there's a term they use in suicide prevention called upstream prevention, and it has to do with building resilience. And as I began learning more about and doing public speaking on mental illness and suicide awareness, I thought a lot about how families and schools can raise more resilient kids who aren't afraid of sadness, like the blue girl in that Inside Out movie some years back. Kids who can express their feelings and ask for help as teenagers, especially when adults are able to speak with them openly about mental health conditions, about modeling self-care and ways to deal with stress. So how do we open that conversation, whether it's with a young person or someone else, if we sense that something is troubling them? You know, it can be as simple as saying, I've noticed you've been kind of listless lately or restless lately. You know, what's going on? Do you want to talk about it? What's important as they begin to talk about it is to not try to persuade them otherwise and say, just try to think happy thoughts. You'll snap out of this. It really is something we need to take seriously. So you've probably seen these 5 signs of emotion, of what they call emotional suffering, possible mental health condition, out there around town on posters and so on. It's a good summary of kind of 5 categories of things that might be happening with someone who's struggling, such as they just don't seem like themselves anymore, big change in their personality. Maybe they're feeling agitated. They've done a lot of withdrawal from their social circle, like we saw Noah defriending people on Facebook and stopping taking phone calls from his friends. They're not able to care for themselves anymore, just basic daily hygiene. And maybe they're talking in a way that shows that they're feeling helpless. So for everyday troubles, you can go a long way with just listening and empathy to somebody who's suffering. For example, one of the techniques you can use is called the VAR, where you validate how somebody is feeling, that it sounds like they're going through a hard time. You appreciate that they're willing to talk to you, because that often takes courage. And you refer them not only to professional outside help if needed, but to some of their own coping strategies that might help. Like if there's somebody who would benefit from going for a run or for just listening to a favorite piece of music or something like that. As far as mental health conditions, there's so many of them, and there's no way I can even get into one of them fully in today's presentation, but just to keep in mind the great variety of conditions that are out there, and how some can be mild, some can be severe, some can be transient, some can be chronic. The most common types of these mental health conditions are anxiety disorders, which come in many forms, major depression, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. And as I look back on it, in many ways, I think it's possible that Noah was going through all of these things as his symptoms were constantly changing, and we never really got a proper diagnosis. One thing to understand about depression, clinical depression, is that it's more than sad. It's, as the author J.K. Rowling says in her case, it was a cold absence of feeling, a really hollowed out feeling. Other people describe depression as a gorilla on your back that just won't leave you alone, that makes every movement in your day quite a burden, quite a pain to go through. And just to realize, as I didn't fully accept at the time, that clinical depression is rooted in a person's biochemistry in the mind. There's so many possible symptoms of depression. I'm sure some of these, like sadness, mood swings, crying, withdrawal, those kinds of things look familiar to you. I know I was surprised that irritability was could be considered one of these symptoms. We saw quite a bit of that in Noah unexpectedly, uncharacteristically for him, as well as confusion, talking negatively about himself where he had previously been quite confident. Of course, changes in sleep habits and eating habits. When depression symptoms become of concern is when they last for more than a few weeks at a time. Depression is often a factor in suicide, and this outdoor exhibit called Send Silence Packing features about 1,000 backpacks representing young people who have died by suicide and their stories. And interspersed among the backpacks are these wonderful signs saying things like, seeking help shows strength, and keep asking and keep searching until something helps with your mental health condition. Something will. I really wish that my son and others who are struggling could see these signs and take them to heart. So many people can manage their mental health conditions through therapy, medication, support groups, action plans, and so on. So how do we know when a person is in crisis? It's generally when those symptoms suddenly get worse to a point where the person really cannot take care of themselves or function on a daily basis, or when they appear to be at risk of harming themselves or others, or sometimes when paranoia or psychosis appears. And then we need to be aware of mental health first aid, just as we try to be aware of physical first aid out there in the world. First, to assess for the risk of suicide or doing harm to others, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Then to listen non-judgmentally, to really be calm and to be slow and deliberate in your words and movements to de-escalate the situation so as not to upset the person further. To reassure them that you're there to help them and some of the possible ways you could help. To encourage them to agree to go to seek professional help and hopefully give them some choices so that they can be involved in what's going on and not just be told what to do by others. Most people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental illness at the time. But most people with mental illness do not kill themselves. The vast majority live out their lives. So some of the key warning signs for suicide, beyond some of the mental health crisis ones we've already looked at, are talk and behavior specifically related to death, and seeing some of those sudden changes, for example, in their personal appearance, in their degree of social isolation, in their abuse of alcohol or drugs. It's a reminder to me of how my son became a shadow of his former self when he came home on leave from college, how he stopped smiling and the light went out of his eyes, and he was talking as if the end was near. At least that's what I see now in retrospect. So one of the most difficult and important aspects of helping to prevent suicide, just as a regular person out there, not as a professional, is to find the words, if you're concerned about someone, to take it seriously and find a way to ask. Find a way to simply ask, I've seen this and this, I'm concerned. Are you possibly thinking of killing yourself? And then be ready to listen calmly to what they have to say, to encourage them to talk as much as they need to talk, and not to try to jump in there to argue with them, to try to persuade them, or to try to fix the problem. Because some people are just waiting for that chance to talk. They are relieved that somebody is asking, they need to vent, and maybe in some cases, that's going to be all they need. They just need to get it off their chest. Of course, if they do say, yes, I'm thinking about it, you need to ask a series of other questions, beginning with, do they have a specific plan for the how, when, and where of their plan to take their life? Do they have access to the means to do it, such as a gun or pills? How likely are they, on a scale of 1 to 10, to act on their suicidal thoughts, whether they've had a prior attempt, and so on? And they're considered to be high risk if they have a specific plan and access to the means. So the very first thing you can try to do is remove the means from the household, such as removing a gun. Stay with them and call 911 or to take them to the ER. If you do call 911, you want to ask for a CIT officer, someone who is crisis intervention trained. On the other hand, if they're just having thoughts and have no specific plan, they may be at lower risk. And hopefully you can agree with them on some kind of an action plan to stabilize them, to help them deal with those thoughts. You can be with them when they call a mental health professional or a crisis line. So what can we be doing to build a more caring community at PJTC when it comes to mental health? First of all, I think to share the belief that every mind matters, that there are all kinds of minds out there, and it's a matter of accepting them, learning as much as we can, and speaking openly to kind of break the silence with all the stigma that surrounds mental illness, suicide, and so on, so that people will feel comfortable sharing their story, reaching out for help to our clergy team, maybe using the Misha Berach list to ask for prayers for healing, not just for physical illness, but for mental health conditions, with the permission of the person, of course, to put their name on that list. And then each of us doing our part to reach out to people around us in our community who we know are struggling, to be ready to listen to them, to encourage their own help seeking, and to include them when we can in activities, whether it be a Shabbat meal, an outing, etc. And not to forget the caregivers, the people who are living with folks who are struggling, because those caregivers are also under a lot of stress, may need some listening, may need some respite care, may need some encouragement to do their own self-care every day. So I've compiled a short list of some resources on both mental health and suicide prevention here. It includes several different kinds of helplines and crisis lines, including for young people. And I'd be really glad to send you this list, including the links directly to the websites. If you email me at this email, Susan Auerbach 56 at Gmail, or at the email that's in the temple directory, or you can call me through the temple directory. And I'm sure you've been seeing all kinds of information in the media out there about how to stay mentally well during the stress of dealing with the pandemic, beginning with good self-care for your body, trying things like meditation, even if you've never tried it before, staying connected to others however you can. And there's all kinds of great information at the link here to the LA County Department of Mental Health, which I'd also be happy to send to you. So I just want to close with a couple of quick suggestions, just tools maybe in this difficult time for dealing with fear, dealing with anxiety, and a sense of burden on our hearts, all the uncertainty about the future. And one is something that I learned in dealing with my own traumatic grief when I was in therapy, which is that you can visualize your safe space in your mind at any time. That would be a space, whether it's real or imagined in the world, that where you feel totally peaceful, where you feel totally content and safe. For me, it's this place by a stream in our local mountains. Whatever it is for you, you can go there in your mind anytime and really try to immerse yourself in what it looks like, what it feels like, what it even smells like to be in that environment that puts you at peace. And another thing I'd like to share, if you'll bear with me a moment again, is just a simple breathing technique. First of all, to try to quiet your breath with long, deep breaths whenever you have a moment to pause and do that. And one thing you might do, taken from some Jewish spirituality practice, is to breathe in the sense of blessings that you have in your life right now, even at this difficult time. And then exhale blessings to go out to all the people you love and are concerned about, and even people you don't know out there in our community, our country, the world. So you'd be breathing in gratitude and breathing out hope for healing and peace for all the many people who are suffering right now, physically and mentally, in our world. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in to this video today. I hope it's been a little helpful for you. I want to wish you and your loved ones physical and mental wellness during this time and beyond. And Chag Sameach to all of you. Thank you.